Okay, Alex, it's been about a minute, so we'll go ahead and get started. But hi, everybody. I am Sarah Kirksey. I am the Senior Director of the Educational Travel Program here at the National WWII Museum. And I am joined today by a museum dear friend, fan favorite, traveler, historian, Dr. Alexandra Richie. She leads our Rise and Fall of Hitler's Germany, which goes Berlin to Warsaw. She also leads our What They Fought Against, the Scars of the Nazi Regime, which is Hamburg to Warsaw. And she is going to be on our Prague to Berlin departure for the End of the War on the Elbe Victory in Europe program. So Alex, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Sarah. It's so wonderful to be here, to be back, and to be talking about this amazing tour. I know that a lot of people, and names I recognize on the roster that are there today. So hello to everybody who's already traveled with me, and also to those who've never traveled with me before, but or with the World War II Museum, but welcome, because I think you'll find that if you join us on any of these tours, you'll find that an amazing experience awaits you. So welcome to the webinar.
Yes, it is. We did one of these the other day for the What They Fought Against, the Scars of the Nazi Regime, and it was so popular. Everybody enjoyed it. It was so fun actually just to talk to you about the tour and what we see and what we're going to do. So I'm excited to talk to them about this program. But let's start off with talking about why we chose the Elbe. Next year is going to be the 80th anniversary, end of the war, and we wanted to do something to commemorate this. And we talked a lot about doing different things, but we kept on coming back to the Elbe. So Alex, talk a little bit about the significance of the Elbe and what took place and why we chose this river cruise on Viking to be a part of the 80th anniversary commemoration.
Well, this year has been all about Normandy landings and the 80th anniversary of the landings in France and how important that was. And what sort of faded in history a little bit over the decades, particularly because of the Cold War and the Iron Curtain, was the absolute sense of relief and excitement and joy and just a sigh of like, oh, it's over in Europe, was when the Red Army and the Americans and Brits, but especially in this case, the Americans and the Red Army met on the Elbe River. Because what did this mean? It meant that Germany, Nazi Germany, which had been such a formidable enemy from 1939 all the way through the war. And there were many, many times when the victory was touch and go. We didn't know if we were going to win. We didn't know if we were going to make it. And then finally, these two massive forces, the Western Allies and the Red Army, meet at the Elbe River, and they shake hands over this sort of bridge that's collapsing, that these refugees trying to get over it. There are already questions about the Red Army and the Soviets and all that, so on. But the fact is that this sense of relief in Europe, that finally the Germans are going to be squeezed out and that there will be a victory in Europe. And in fact, of course, it happens very, very quickly after that, because we're talking about the 25th of May and Hitler commits suicide in the bunker a few days later. And then the peace is signed and it's done, and it's VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. But it's so important, and I think a lot of this emotion and the feelings has been lost over the decades, just because we concentrate now so much on Normandy, and because of all of the problems with the Cold War and Stalin and everything else, that we forget about that incredible sense of relief and joy that finally the war in Europe is going to be over. And that is symbolized by the Elbe River.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And this is exactly why we chose this program and tour to celebrate the 80th anniversary of end of war in Europe. Now, let's just kind of talk about the day-by-day itinerary. So the first day to the Prague to Berlin, it starts on May 1st, and you are going to arrive in Prague. So you're going to go from the airport, be picked up, taken to the beautiful Hotel Augustine. It's city center Prague, and it's just a gorgeous hotel. And what we're going to actually start with is a welcome reception and lecture. We haven't even mentioned that actually joining you is Dr. Michael Nyberg. So we will have this wonderful welcome reception where everybody gets to meet the team from the museum that's going to be on the tour, but also you and Mike. And then, Alex, you and Mike, though, let's talk about that for a second. Y'all are dear friends, and we're so excited to get to travel all together.
Well, one of the great things about the World War II museum tours is that some of them anyway are unique. Some of them don't have historians, but those that do, really the museum is incredible at trying to gather together historians who really know their subjects very well, but actually also really love meeting with people and talking to one another and are real colleagues and real friends. And I've been lucky enough to work with Mike Nyberg for years and years. We are dear, dear friends. And the great thing is that we have tremendous respect for one another because we both do sort of different things. He's an incredible expert on France, on the whole question of Vichy France and North African, the campaigns in Western Europe and so on. Just an amazing, amazing scholar and historian. Whereas I tend to focus on Germany, the Eastern Front, Prague. These sorts of things are much more sort of my natural territory. And yet we've overlapped on so many things. Many, many times we've been at conferences together. We ask each other questions. We ask each other, what about this footnote? Should I put this here? Whatever. Just a wonderful human being, tremendously personable, loves talking to people. And some of your guests today will have been on some of his tours that he's done for the museum, particularly in France and elsewhere. And so there's nothing more wonderful for me, particularly on something like this Elbe tour, that what we try and do, because we're together so much of the time, is that every evening we will have, in the bar, in this sort of space that we can find for everybody who wants to come, can come and listen to not a lecture, but Q&A, questions and answers, both between the two of us and also then with audience participation. What did we see today? What are we going to see tomorrow? What do you think about this? What about religion under the Nazis? What about the importance of the French to the events on the Elbe? Why were the French not participating, et cetera, et cetera. These are the sorts of things that we do, and it just adds to this atmosphere and this energy and this wonderful kind of dialogue, not just between a historian and an audience, but between everybody who's participating. And that's what I'm so looking forward to, because Mike and I get along so well, but he's just such a knowledgeable, incredible scholar, but also just such a nice, wonderful person who doesn't, absolutely loves talking to people. Any questions are open, fair game for him.
And that is so true. And we've done these tours before. I've been with Mike, but I've also been with you, where it's so fun to come back in the evenings and talk about what you either saw that day or what you're going to see the next day. And it's these casual conversations, though, that just make our educational travel programs just something even more special. And it's that intimate conversations. Like you said, it's not a lecture, but it's an ongoing conversation. And I just love that's how we're going to have every evening, but starting on the first night, that's how it's going to begin. So with the second day, we're going to be leaving Prague and we'll be heading to the Viking luxury Bela. It's a beautiful ship, but before we embark, we are actually going to go, you'll have an option to do 2 different excursions that day. And one of them is being Terezín, a concentration camp. Alex, will you talk a little bit about the significance of this camp and really actually what sets it apart from other concentration and extermination camps in Nazi Germany and in the regime?
So the richness of this program is profound, and Theresienstadt's just one of these places that we're going to see. For anybody who's been, for example, on one of my Rise and Fall tours, we go to a place called Track 17. Track 17 is a memorial to the Jews who were forcibly rounded up and forced out of Berlin because Goebbels wanted Berlin to be free of Jews. And one of the most important and main places that the Jews of Berlin are sent is to Theresienstadt. Why? Because Theresienstadt was sent up as a model camp. It was, of course, all fake. It was a terrible place, just like all the other camps were. But it was for what the Germans called the Prominenten. And Berlin and other big German cities were full of Jews who were, theater directors or owned huge banks or were industrialists or had fought in World War I and had been, let's say, awarded the Iron Cross first class. And these were German citizens who they wanted to kind of put in a place that made it look as if they were treating these prominent Jews well, in quotation marks. And that's what Theresienstadt was originally set up for. And so when you look at somewhere like Treblinka, for example, which was the absolute sort of extermination of the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto, that was one side of the Holocaust. But another side of it was the lying, the deception, the venal attitude of the Nazis toward their victims to try and make it look to the rest of the world as if everything was fine. And so Theresienstadt's unique because it's not a prison camp, concentration camp in the mode of Dachau or Bergen-Belsen. The actual town of Theresienstadt is itself the camp. And so what the Nazis did was they set up, artists, and they had theaters, and the Jewish prisoners were allowed to grow vegetable gardens, or they would, be dressed up in beautiful clothes. Of course, it was all a complete sham and very often done and set up to fool the Red Cross into thinking that it was just this wonderful place, and propaganda films were made and so on. And then, of course, once the Red Cross left, the hapless victims were then sent off to places like Auschwitz or to other camps in the East. And so Theresienstadt was also emptied out of its inhabitants, and people were murdered. But I suppose one of the reasons it's so unique is that it's just so obviously such a sham, and it shows that the Nazis knew that what they were doing was a crime. They knew this was wrong. They were trying to set it up to make it look as if it was all just fine, but they knew perfectly well what the fate of the Jews in Theresienstadt was going to be as well. And so this is one of the reasons it's so important to visit it. It kind of pulls the scales from the eyes as to this overall plan and also knowledge of what the Nazis had in mind for the Jewish victims, and also how they were trying to cover it up.
And it's definitely so different from the other camps that we travel or visit on our other educational travel programs. And it's definitely a hard stop, but it's so important to do and see and always remember. But so the next day, though, we are going to actually have a morning at leisure where we'll have, we can have those morning conversations between you and Mike as we make our way to either Königstein or Pirna. Now, again, there's two choices this day. Let's start with Königstein Castle. Alex, talk a little bit about what took place there.
Well, Königstein Castle is an incredible it's how do you describe it? It's this massive, just impressive to see it anyways, this massive kind of medieval castle jutting out on this hill overlooking the Elbe River. It's this tremendously kind of romantic, amazing place. However, the problem with it, I suppose, is that you have a sort of, let's say, more sinister history. Because it does turn into an Auflag. It becomes a prisoner of war camp. And again, when you see it, you know exactly why. Because the Germans, whether you're talking about Stalag Luft 3 out in the middle of nowhere in sandy soil so that the officers can't dig and escape, well, you put prisoners of war in somewhere like Königstein, they're supposed to not be able to escape either. One of the inmates, however, though, and this is what Mike Nyberg will talk about in much more detail, is that Henri Giraud, who was one of the great leaders of France during the war, because he resisted Vichy and was very determined to reinstate the free French, to fight against the Nazis by hook or by crook. He escaped from this castle by over weeks and months, getting together bed sheets and twine and all these other things. He was working in cahoots with the SOE, the Special Operations Executive in the UK, in order to mastermind the escape. So then he got papers and so on, and he was able actually to get back to the French, the Free French, and then of course became this very important historical figure for the rest of the war in France. So again, this is a fantastically interesting site. As I said, you see it for the first moment, you think, oh my goodness, I'm so glad I saw this place. And then you start to realize the history, World War II history, slightly more complex. But what an amazing site.
And it is beautiful. The views overlooking the Elbe River, they are absolutely gorgeous. But if you don't choose to go to Königstein, you can actually go into Perna at Schonenstein. So talk about the euthanasia program and what we're going to see there, Alex, where you're going to go with the group.
Yeah, I'll be taking the group to Sonnenstein Castle, and Sonnenstein Castle is so important on the road to the euthanasia program in Germany, but also the road to the Holocaust. And one of the things that the Nazis did, even before the Holocaust really got going in 1942 with the extermination camps and so on in under full swing, the Germans had various steps on the road to the Holocaust, and one of them was the creation of euthanasia. And euthanasia in the beginning, for example, the early use of gas or lethal injections was not against the Jews or these foreign victims. It was against their own people who they considered to be useless eaters, people who were handicapped in some way. If you had Down syndrome, if you had multiple sclerosis, if you had some other genetic defect or something that the Nazis considered you to be not worthy of being part of the so-called Volksgemeinschaft, this new Nazi Aryan society they were trying to create, you were liable to be killed. This included thousands and thousands of children. And so Sonnenstein was one of these places that had been an institution from the 19th century. It was a beautiful castle in the Elbe, absolutely gorgeous. And it had become a hospital and institution already. But then it was designated as one of the big centers for euthanasia. And it's absolutely chilling to go into these places, because this is the first place, for example, where the Nazis used poison gas in the form of showers, pretending that the victims would go and have showers and so on. And as I said, lethal injections. And about 15,000 people were killed in this facility under the euthanasia program. Now, the euthanasia program was stopped, at least nominally stopped, because of German protests by people like Archbishop Galen, who stood up and said, we don't want our Down syndrome kids being killed. And there was a backlash against it. So it kind of went underground. But nevertheless, Sonnenstein was one of those facilities that, first of all, killed 15,000 of Germany's own citizens, but was also very much a step on the way to the Holocaust, to the mass extermination of the Jews in facilities that were industrial killing centers, but that the doctors and the specialists, in quotes, and the technicians and the engineers who were used to create a place like Sonnenstein were then used to create these huge, vast extermination facilities. So it's all linked together to the horrors of Nazi Germany.
And so then we'll go back onto the Viking, and we'll continue sailing to Dresden. Dresden is one of my favorite places that I've been in Germany, simply because how gorgeous it is, which of course that was a part of the issue from the bombing. It was destroying the gorgeous Dresden city. Talk a little bit about the bombing, of course, but what we're going to be doing and seeing in Dresden today.
Of course, the bombing of Dresden has become a kind of symbol of the sort of horrors of bombing raids and so on, because it was, as you say, one of the most beautiful German cities, sort of Baroque splendor, absolutely gorgeous, and the Swinger Palace and the Frauenkirche and the art galleries and so on. And it was considered to be one of the gems of Central Europe until the bombing raid. The bombing raid was controversial because this was this debate, which we'll talk about on the cruise, between the bomber Harris view of the war, which was you just destroy all German cities, it doesn't matter, even if there's not much industrial merit to it, versus the now more thoughtful, maybe this isn't such a good idea. Even Churchill starts to change toward the end of the war. Maybe we should be thinking more about targeting oil refineries and ball bearings plants rather than just killing all citizens and so on. And so there was this debate going on. So the bombing of Dresden remains controversial, something we'll talk about a lot. And one of the people, the authors that adds to this controversy, of course, is Kurt Vonnegut, the book Slaughterhouse-Five, which is very, very famous. And we will go at least to some of the areas that he writes about in his very famous novel. It's a controversial, difficult topic, but of course it very much ties into the bombing war. Many of you will have seen Masters of the Air. We talk about, you know, the importance of the bombing war in the defeat of Germany. If it hadn't happened, then, you know, how much longer would we have had to fight the Germans? And the bombing war was actually very effective when you're talking about the destruction of industrial complexes. And there were indeed industries in Dresden as well, which is sometimes not mentioned. But the destruction of the oil refineries, the destruction of ball bearing plants, synthetic oil refineries, ammunitions plants, and so on. The bombing raid had a very, very important impact on the war. And so this is a debate that's going to run and run amongst historians and others forever. So it's something we'll discuss, of course, a lot on this tour.
And I look forward to hearing you and Mike debate about it. That's also another fun thing is, you know, although you and Mike are such good friends and you get along beautifully and you're both so brilliant, at times you probably won't agree about things. And I always find that so fascinating when you're listening to historians debate and go back and forth on different topics.
Absolutely. We disagree about lots of things, but in a friendly way. He usually convinces me to change my mind. So that's
So when we leave Dresden, though, we are going to start heading towards Meissen and then, of course, Torgau. So those, the morning will be Meissen, known for its porcelain. We'll have a walking tour, and then we'll drive to Torgau. If you want to talk a little bit about both sides or maybe focus on Torgau, or
well,
you know.
Absolutely. No, well, Meissen, I mean, like so many sites on the Elbe River, if you go as a tourist now, you go to the porcelain manufactory and you go, isn't this lovely, whatever else. But it has, of course, a hugely important Nazi history because Hitler and Albert Speer and Goering and Goebbels and all the others loved Meissen porcelain, and Meissen became very much a collector's item and for the top Nazis. And in fact, in Meissen, in the porcelain manufacturer, in their historical archive, they have order books from the war period, 33 to 45. And you've got these orders from, you know, Hitler would like this kind of dinner set. Hermann Goering was always ordering stuff. You know, he wants something in the Baroque style. But all of them were. Hans Frank, Goebbels, all the rest of them were all ordering these things. There are pictures of Hitler with Himmler and Speer looking at porcelain figurines in the Meissen style. And even more important was, I've got here a little sort of a figure, which is, this is not Meissen porcelain, but it just shows it was made for the, you can't really see it, but it was made for the mother. It's a kind of badge porcelain for mothers who had more than 9 children, and it depicts a mother over a baby cot. This is the sort of thing that was made for, you know, as a sort of badge of honor for women who had all these children for the Nazi war machine. And then even more chilling was that the porcelain manufacturer called Allach was, because of this love of porcelain, and as I said, these sort of Hitler busts and so on, you don't find them very often nowadays, but they were very popular, was actually moved to Dachau, so that the people who were prisoners, who had some experience in porcelain manufacture, were put together in a special facility in Dachau to churn out this Allach porcelain. So it's all linked to the Nazi propaganda machine, the Nazi elite, the Nazi, you know, every middle-class household would have had an Allach porcelain figurine set, chess set, or whatever it might be in their house. And this is all linked to this history of Meissen porcelain. And by the way, Goebbels said the Meissen porcelain, which traditionally had been painted very often in all sorts of colors, was to be white. Most of this Nazi porcelain is white. Why? Because of the Aryan race, you know, all this pure white porcelain. And the marks underneath are like SS, which is almost like the crossed swords of the Meissen brand. And it's so interesting how all of this works together. And then, of course, we're going on to Torgau. And Torgau really is, if you will, the height of the tour, in the sense that this is the moment where the American troops meet the Soviet troops at this destroyed bridge on the Elbe River. And this really marks the moment when Nazi Germany is completely then finally finished, because the two massive armies have crossed from one from Normandy all the way across Western Europe, and the other from pushing the Germans back from Moscow and all the way through and almost at, almost getting Berlin. And they meet at Torgau and squeeze the Germans finally into realizing they just cannot fight any longer. And that's when you start seeing the top Nazis deserting the sinking ship, if you will, in the bunker. They're all trying to leave, all trying to make deals with the Western Allies or whatever else. And then you get, of course, the meeting at Torgau, which is, of course, the first meetings aren't photographed, but then the Allied and Red Army film crews come in, and they sort of recreate the meetings at the bridge and so on. But nevertheless, even though these scenes are slightly recreated, it's the same people, and they're very, very moving, because you see the real joy and elation before the Cold War stuff starts happening, the real joy and relief of these two massive armies, just the spearheads of these two massive armies meeting at the Elbe River. And now we know that the war in Europe has days, just days, hours to run.
And, one thing I do love about Torgau is when we're with the local guides and they're walking us around the town, they have some of the original newspapers with those photos, even though, like you said, it's posed, and they'll tell you exactly where this photo was taken of, the Soviets shaking hands with the Americans. We'll go to the monuments. And you actually still see that joy from the local guides today. They talk about the significance and the importance, and are just so thankful that that link up on the Elbe took place in Torgau.
Well, exactly, because it's a small provincial place, and you could be forgiven for saying, well, that's really nice and let's move on. But you have to think about what it means, the symbolism of it. We were just at the Normandy landing anniversary, so the risk that was taken with Normandy, was it going to work? Were the boys going to be able to get out from the beaches? What was going to happen? Same with the Red Army. There were many, many times when it looked as if the Nazis were going to win on the Eastern Front. They were horrific. Siege of Leningrad. They almost got Moscow. I mean, it was touch and go for a very long time, and huge amounts of fighting and so on. These massive armies, the arsenal of democracy, the boys being shipped off to Europe and so on. And it's all that comes together in this little tiny town at Torgau. That's what this place means. It means this huge effort, this global effort to defeat Nazism is just within reach at Torgau. And it's tremendously moving. It's nobody could not be moved to tears by seeing this place where, okay, now it's going to be over. Okay, we still have the rest of the war in Japan, but at least Europe's going to be done.
Yeah. So when we leave Torgau, though, we'll continue sailing on the river. We go to Wittenberg. This is famous for Martin Luther's 95 Thesis. But also I think it's such an interesting stop. You brought up earlier in this webinar talking about religion during 1933 to 1945. But it kind of goes way before that with the significance of this place.
Well, Wittenberg, of course, is enormously important because of the Reformation and because of Martin Luther and so on. But if we, again, bring it back to the Nazi era, there's so many interesting debates about how both the Catholic and the Protestant Church, or the Lutheran Church, behaved in Germany during World War II, which is something, again, that we'll talk about a lot when we're on the tour. And Wittenberg, of course, is if you will, memorializes, or it invites us to ask these questions about the Lutheran Church and the Protestant churches in Germany. And unfortunately, both the main churches, unlike in many of the occupied areas of Europe, really did collapse into the Nazi hierarchy. And you've got these sort of horrible, scenes of very important people in both churches, giving the Nazi salute on the steps of their relative cathedrals and so on. And Wittenberg's no exception. It was very much used by the Nazis in their propaganda. Hitler had Martin Luther's later and anti-Semitic works on his bedside table. It's not Martin Luther's fault, but this was used. And in fact, we have even a very interesting marker on the town city church in Wittenberg, which is called a Judenschau, which is a very controversial object to this day, which is an old sort of relic from the Middle Ages, showing the anti-Semitism that existed in Germany for centuries, because it's a very sort of demeaning picture of a pig with a rabbi and two Jews around this pig. And it's kind of a very unpleasant thing. And fortunately, the Germans, there was a big debate as to whether or not to keep this on this church in Wittenberg. And what the Germans decided to do after the collapse of communism, when there was a huge debate about historiography in Germany and how should Germany deal with its Nazi past and its whole anti-Semitic past. And the decision was made to keep it because it is such a kind of a shocking remnant of that history, but also then to put a big marker and to explain what it was, and in a way the shame of it now in Germany and in the sort of history of German anti-Semitism. But it's a very interesting, again, something to see and something to talk about. And Wittenberg's, on the other hand, is just a beautiful little town. It's absolutely stunningly beautiful. It wasn't destroyed during the war, particularly. Well, there was some destruction, some bombing there as well, because there were industrial outposts there. Of course, again, there were concentration camp inmates who were sent as slave laborers in Wittenberg, like in practically every town and city in Germany. So again, we'll talk about all those layers and layers of that Nazi past. But it's certainly a fantastically interesting place historically to see, not least, as I said, because of its importance in the Reformation.
Absolutely. And so when we leave there, though, it's such a contrast going to Magdeburg. Dresden destroyed, Wittenberg wasn't, but then Magdeburg so heavily bombed. And that's actually the last stop while we are, on the Viking Bela. We'll have a walking tour of Magdeburg. But if you want to talk about that a little bit and what we'll see and do there.
Well, I mean, Magdeburg, again, one of the things that happens because of the Cold War, I mean, because of the First World War, because of Nazi Germany, because of the Cold War, is that these areas in the heart, what was the heart of Germany, really lose their significance very much after World War II. Magdeburg is just on the eastern side of the wall. It took a long time for it to be rebuilt. It was quite an industrial city. It was a very left-wing city. It was very anti-Hitler, actually, for much of the 1930s. Nevertheless, because of its industrial power, it was quite badly damaged during the war, and it took a very long time for anything to be rebuilt there. The cathedral was not totally destroyed, so it still stands. We'll be able to see that, and there's a sort of magnificent statue that was done by a 1930s German sculptor who was very anti-war, and that was put up in the 20s, and then of course the Nazis took it down and it's been replaced in the church. There's a lot of this interesting history in Magdeburg and all of these sort of layers and layers. It's also the place where, for example, Hitler's body was taken after 1945, when it was discovered just outside Hitler's bunker. Hitler's and Eva Braun's bodies were taken by the Soviets to a Soviet enclave in Magdeburg, just on the edge of Magdeburg, where the bodies were eventually, they were supposedly, you can never be 100% sure with Soviet historiography, but eventually they were finally destroyed and dumped in the river, although there are parts of Hitler's jawbone that still apparently exist in Moscow. But so all of these layers and layers, again, one of the things that I think is so fascinating about this tour is obviously talking about the Nazi past, but then talking about the way in which the Germans, both in East Germany and in West Germany, dealt with this past in these very different ways, and for obvious reasons. The Iron Curtain was up in the East, and there was no freedom of speech or interpretations of the past, whereas in West Germany it was all these sort of amazing debates and so on, and that has implications on East Germany to this day. And Magdeburg's a place where I know Mike and I will talk a lot about this, and what does this mean for contemporary Germany to this day. I just want to just say one thing as we're now, quote unquote, leaving the Bela, but one thing I want to say about the World War II museum tours for all of you who've traveled with us before, and for those of you who haven't, is that we always not only try and maintain the sort of historical standards of the really interesting debates and historiography, but also style, great food, great hotels, a wonderful atmosphere, and the Viking Bela, one of the great American companies, tourism companies around of the world, with its standards of luxury and so on, is no exception. The hotel in Prague, absolutely gorgeous, fantastic food, wonderful atmosphere. And the same is true on the Bela. And one of the things I love about being on the river is that you can actually relax. You don't have to move every couple of days. You put your luggage on board, and then you can just relax, and everything's sort of provided for you there. And then we can talk and chat and go and explore and come back to the ship in style. So that's that one thing I wanted to say about the Bela, because it's so beautiful, such a beautiful ship.
It is, and I personally love whenever I'm on a river cruise, and it's just like you said, it's a stylish way of traveling, and that's one thing that the National WWII Museum, it's a part of our standards, is the luxury aspect of our tours. But and speaking of luxury, but the last night of the tour, when we disembark off the Bela and we do the walking tour of Magdeburg, we actually go to Berlin for one night, and that's the last evening where we will have our farewell reception, our dinner, closing conversations and thoughts from both you and Mike, but at the Roccoforte Berlin Hotel, which is such a fascinating location of the hotel because of what took place. Do you want to talk about that, Alex?
Well, the Roccoforte is really right in the just about 5 minutes walk from the Brandenburg Gate. It's actually right next to the Babelsplatz, across from what's now called the Humboldt University. And in that space between the Humboldt University and the hotel is the place where, for example, the Goebbels book burning took place. So in other words, when the Nazis decided that a lot of literature was not acceptable any longer, and not just Karl Marx and Bertolt Brecht, but also people like Helen Keller and Ernest Hemingway and people like that. They were not acceptable anymore, and they were burnt on this square. So it's actually very chilling to see it. And there's a memorial there with a kind of underground library in glass, kind of memorializing this. But the whole area is so important because it's right next to the Wilhelmstrasse, which was the main government street under Nazi Germany. So all of the big ministries that were there, Hitler's Reichschancellery was there, and his bunker where he committed suicide, Goebbels' propaganda ministry, everything you can imagine. The apparatus of the Nazi kind of spider web of power was based literally within a stone's throw of the hotel. And so, of course, we'll talk a lot about that as well, and how the Nazis managed to get to power and then hold on to power in the way they did.
And one thing I do love about the hotel, they actually have copies of the books that were once burned on that plot, they're now on display, or they're available at the hotel, either on the bookshelves or in the hotel rooms, in the lounge area. I love that they commemorate and remember those authors, the people that were once banned. They're now on display at the Roccoforte Hotel. But so if you are doing just the river cruise, you will have, like I said, the last farewell reception and dinner. Then the next morning you will, fly back to the States. Or if you have chosen to extend your stay and do our 3-night post tour, continuing on with both Alex and Mike from the rubble, we are going to be in Berlin over VE Day. And this is going to be 3 days of touring. It's going to be fabulous. There's a couple of we're going to go to sites that we don't go on our Rise and Fall of Hitler's Germany tour, and Alex is actually going to be continuing these conversations with Mike, but some other special things that we have planned. Alex, talk a little bit about things in Berlin.
Well, first off, I don't want to say anything about this yet because it's not written in stone, but we have invited a couple of special guests. One is if they can come. So this is if one is Levine von Trotzisalz, who's one of the families of one of the great resistance families, who's commemorated in German history, and another is actually Katrin Himmler, Heinrich Himmler's niece. And one of the films that I like to show on board is a film called The Decent One, which is about which Katrin Himmler helped put together, about Himmler being in his daily life perfectly ordinary, quite boring man actually, and then how he turns into be running this most horrific SS hierarchy and system. And if we're lucky, she'll be able to come and talk to us as well on one of these evenings. We're going to do some things that are a little bit different because, as Sarah said, we're commemorating the end of the war. And one of the really, really amazing places that we will go to on this tour is Karlshorst. Karlshorst was where the Soviets set up their headquarters, where they, because they didn't agree with the way in which the 8th of May signing took place in Lens. So they set up their own signing in Karlshorst. And so there's a museum there now for this Soviet headquarters where the Soviet version of the capitulation was signed. And again, tremendously moving, the representatives from all of the powers, and of course, footage of this signing and so on. And of course, in the rubble of Berlin. So there are a number of things. We'll also go to Potsdam. We'll see a number of important sites there. So just a kind of a rounding up of the really tremendously momentous things that were taking place. And also the debate as to, should the Western Allies have gone to Berlin or not? Was this a wise policy? Why did Eisenhower make this decision, or Bradley? What were the complications? What were the implications of this as the Cold War starts to develop and so on? So fantastically interesting. And I have to say that the same is true also of Prague, because for those on the pre-tour, we do have a couple of days in Prague, and we will see places like Lidice, for example. We'll talk about Operation Anthropoid, Heydrich and his rule domination of Prague. He very quickly gets the epithet the Butcher of Prague, and then where he was killed in Operation Anthropoid, this Czech-British operation to assassinate him on this road from his villa into Prague. So these sort of bookends of the tour are also fascinating and filled with information, material, and perhaps going to places that as an ordinary tourist you might not be able to go.
And I'm glad you said the pre-tour. I was about to say, let's backtrack and go back to Prague, but that's perfect. And so we have these two optional extensions. You can do the Prague pre-tour, Operation Anthropoid, what Alex was just mentioning, or you can do From the Rubble, Berlin in World War II and the Cold War, which is the end, 3 nights in Berlin at the Rocco Forte. It's such a beautiful tour. And this particular departure, though, this is May 1 to 8. This is with Dr. Alexandra Richie and Dr. Michael Nyberg. But if those dates don't work, or maybe you want to go a little bit later, we also have another departure that actually begins in Berlin and then it makes its way to Prague, and it's going to be led by a favorite of the and friend to the museum, Keith Lowe, but also our own Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracies senior historian Mark Calhoun. And those dates are May 6th to 13, and it's the same touring, but with the exception there is a Berlin pre-tour. It's not going to be the same optional touring that we just talked about with Berlin, but the post-tour in Prague will actually be the same Operation Anthropoid. So if you can't make the Prague to Berlin, I do invite you to consider doing the second departure with both Keith and Mark. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Alex.
I just wanted to say that it's really, again, this special atmosphere on board a cruise like this, and with Keith and Mark as well. The discussion, the interaction, the sort of insights that each different historian brings, their own expertise, their own history, and their own perspective on history, and they're always interesting discussions, and they'll touch on things that Mike and I wouldn't have touched on, and vice versa. But it's always interesting. It always adds to the experience, and the most important thing is which is so very much part of these tours, is to engage people in discussion, because so many people come on these tours already have so much knowledge, such deep and rich knowledge, and they often know more than the historians do about a very specific or certain areas. And there's nothing more wonderful than somebody sort of getting up and going, actually, I know a lot about this particular subject because I was stationed in, blah, 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 and I did this and this and this. and then that just brings up a whole new range of topics, and that's the whole point, is this wonderful dialogue and discussion between people who are just interested and want to learn. And the other side, I would say, is that for those who are not sort of super World War II buffs, because we also go to places like Dresden or Prague or Meissen or Berlin, that even if you're slightly like, it's enough World War II, there are also these beautiful, beautiful places, luxurious hotels, gorgeous food, wonderful company, and fantastic accommodation on the ship. And of course, going up the Elbe River, it's just a beautiful and important river. And as I said, it's only now being rediscovered because it was so cut off because of the Cold War. And now we couldn't have traveled like this, you know, until 1989. And now once again, this river is open to us, and you can see the beauty of it and the sights just drifting along, you know, out of your window or off one of the decks, just looking out the window and watching the scenery go by. So much of it, there's so many facets and so many different things, for really something for everybody.
Yeah, it is. And I know we talked about the luxury, but it's a beautiful way to travel. Yes, the history, that's what's so important. And with the featured historians that we have, you're going to get the best. But then it is so nice to be able to stay in these beautiful places, have these wonderful meals. It's an overall, to me, just the perfect package, and truly the best way to travel and learn more about World War II, and especially on this program to commemorate the 80th anniversary, end of the war in Europe, VE Day. Now, Alex, we only have just a couple of more minutes, but I just wanted to, I did want to just take a moment and plug actually your two other programs, because a lot of people that are choosing to travel along with us to commemorate this 80th anniversary and to be with us on the Elbe have not traveled with you, though, on your rise and fall of Hitler's Germany, or what they fought against, the scars of the Nazi regime. So why don't you just take a moment or two to talk about those two programs, but then talk about where you are specifically, because I think that's definitely one of the highlights of both of those tours.
Okay, well, so there are two tours that I do, and I love to do. As some of you already know, I'm a specialist in German history and history of Eastern Central Europe and the Soviet Union, the Winter War and the Baltics and so on. So this region, and on the first tour that you mentioned, the rise and fall of Hitler's Germany, really we start in Berlin, which is, of course, as a totally different program from what we are going to do on the Elbe tour. Going to Potsdam, where the Potsdam Conference was, and so on. We go after some days in Berlin to Stalag 3, the scene of the Great Escape. We go to Wrocław. We see a museum actually dedicated to my father-in-law, who was a very well-known Polish resistance fighter, former Auschwitz inmate, and so on. We then go to Krakow and to Auschwitz. We take this luxurious train all the way up to Gdansk. We stay at Sopot, which is this beautiful hotel on the Baltic where Hitler actually stayed when he was overseeing the invasion of Poland, which is mind-boggling. We go to Westerplatte, where the first shots of the war were fired. Then to Gdansk, we go to the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's strange bunker complex out in the middle of nowhere, and then end up back in Warsaw to go to a number of very important sites of both Jewish Warsaw Ghetto and a number of museums in Warsaw itself. And we end up in, well, you see behind me a bit of my library. You can see my helmets, both a German one and a Soviet one that we got out of the pond. This is a little manor house just outside of Warsaw that my husband and I, my husband was born in Poland. I met him in England many years ago, but we fixed this place up, and over the years discovered its history. So partly discovered its history because every time we dig something up in the garden, we find either a helmet or shells or other amazing things, relics of the war, but also discovered along the way that it was, first of all, taken over by a German family in 1939, given to the Germans as sort of colonialization, the Alsbach family. Then it became, under them as well, a sort of billeting center for Wehrmacht officers. And then it became the headquarters of the Viking SS in 1944, just before the Warsaw Uprising. So it's actually it's very chilling on the one hand to be in a place that was, you know, headquarters of the Viking SS. These were the volunteers who came from Norway and Netherlands and so on under Herbert Gilla. but it's also, as a historian, absolutely thrilling. And so we always have a final dinner here. And I invite everybody to look at this. I've got a huge collection of Nazi propaganda era posters and books and magazines and leaflets, plus many of the things that we found on the property. So it's an incredibly interesting and fun way to sort of discuss this history. And the second tour I do is slightly less, hits more obscure, but in some ways more interesting places that you would never get to go unless you came on this tour. Starting in Hamburg this time, talking of course about the bombing raids in Hamburg and what it's like to have been in a bunker when Hamburg was being bombed. But then we see places like the Valentin bunker, this massive bunker complex that Albert Speer built in the idea that he was going to create these new types of U-boats and send them out and win the war that way. We go to the huge memorial in Kiel, which was used during the Nazi period to memorialize those men who died at sea. And then we go to some of the really interesting, very obscure places, these little museums that people have started, almost volunteers really will come and open up, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon when they finished work. Places like the police synthetic oil plant. And the reason that the title is what we were fighting against was it just shows the massive effort that the Germans, the Nazis, had to make in order to, in a way, guard themselves against the tremendous bombing raids that were taking place by our boys in the West. The Ruhr Valley and all the ball bearing plants, everything else being smashed to pieces. They started moving everything to the east, including synthetic oil plants. We go to a huge, massive place called the Explosium, which is one of the largest weapons manufacturing centers in the east. We also go to this sort of almost Maginot Line-like creation that Hitler madly starts to build, in the late part of the war. And then we come back to Warsaw. We see Treblinka, which is, in my view, the worst of the extermination camps, if you can ever have some sort of measure like that, because so few people survived and so many people were murdered there. It's absolutely unthinkably horrific. And then to Warsaw, where we see a number of very important sites, again, that we don't see when we're on the rise and fall. And again, we end up with the dinner here at this little manor house. And the thing about the final dinner is it's really so wonderful because it's a chance for everybody just to kind of relax and talk about what we've seen, because we see and talk about some very, very interesting, sometimes very difficult, but really, I would say, world history level events and places that you really would not be likely to be able to see if you just decided to travel by yourself in Germany or in Poland. So that's something that I consider to be very, very, very special. And of course, being here in this study is to me, it's just sharing a little bit of that history, because I spend so much of my time in Poland, and it's also talking about what happened after the war, or during the war, after the war, after the collapse of communism, and how Poland and Central Europe has recovered from this terrible, terrible conflict. So it's a fascinating suite. Both of these tours are just wonderful. I love doing them.
Well, so if you cannot join us from Prague to Berlin on the end of the war on the Elbe River cruise for the 80th anniversary VE Day, I hope that you can join Alex, Barbara, and me, or Darcy or Ellie, on either what they fought against, the scars of the Nazi regime, or the rise and fall of Hitler's Germany. Alex, that's really all we have time for, but I just want to say one more time to everybody, thank you for joining in. I hope to see you on one of these departures. Like I said, the May 1 to 8, that is going to be led by Dr. Alexandra Richie and Dr. Michael Nyberg, beginning in Prague. You can, we still have the space on the optional pre-tour Operation Anthropoid. We'll then sail towards Berlin, where we will end. We do have the extension from the rubble, Berlin in World War II and the Cold War. Just a couple more spaces left on that one. So if you want to definitely stay in Berlin and do this with Mike and Alex, I highly recommend adding now. But if those dates don't work, or if you want to do the opposite departure, we have space with that as well. That is May 6th to 13. That's led by Keith Lowe and is also Jenny Craig Institute Study for the World. The Study for Democracy and War, excuse me, I'm so sorry, from the National World War II Museum senior historian Mark Calhoun. They'll have a pre-tour in Berlin and also the post-tour in Prague. So I hope you can join us on one of these departures. It's going to be amazing, a wonderful, wonderful experience. I'm so excited. And Alex, thank you so much to you for being here, for being this amazing historian and friend to the National World War II Museum, but also to me. I just love traveling with you. I can't wait for those that haven't traveled with you to get to travel with you, but then also for those that are repeat travelers. You know how great she is and how much fun and what an amazing journey we will have.
It will be great. I cannot wait. I'm so looking forward to it. And welcome to all of you, or any of you who are thinking about doing this, or one of the other tours as well with the World War II Museum. It's always great fun, and certainly a learning experience, but we also have that luxury side as well. So it's always nice, a nice combination.
And one thing I do want to add, the early bird discount, it did expire on July 31st. However, if you are watching this webinar, or if you watch the link after we send it out, if you call our sales team in the travel department and you mention this webinar, we will extend the early bird discount specifically to you, our viewers, for tuning in. Thank you for giving up your time and listening. I am so excited to travel with all of you. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. And I look forward to seeing you in Europe on our Elbe River cruise. The link up on the Elbe and Torgau. Let's commemorate the 80th anniversary end of war in Europe. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.